one element of this class that is not true with a lot of other upper level econ and finance courses is we're all coming in really with very different backgrounds. Since this course is cross-listed economics and finance, gets a lot of students who just need an upper level business elective, students that need a finance course, etc. So one thing I like to do at the beginning of this course is just make sure we've got those key ideas down from principles of economics courses. And so that's how we're going to start off today, is thinking about the three key markets in economics. And these markets are going to reappear throughout the semester somewhat randomly, and you need to have the skills to understand what these graphs are representing, how to interpret them, how to manipulate them. And so that's what we're going to do really quickly right now. If you really think you're struggling with this, let me know and I can try to get you some resources that'll help you gain those basic skills that we're going to need for this class. This is just a review. Okay, so in no real particular order here, we'll start out with the very basic market of just goods, okay? This is normally what you'll see to begin a Principles of Micro or Principles of Macroeconomics course. The basic idea here is to be able to think about markets in general, okay? So in this market, we're going to think about the connection between price and quantity, all right? So when goods become more expensive or cheaper, how do people react? And of course, there's two main actors in a market, the producers and the consumers. And they both have different feelings about a higher price versus a lower price, right? A high price is good if you're selling the good, but a high price is bad if you're the one buying the good. So we have two opposite relationships. So the supply curve is represented with an upward slope because when prices go up, producers produce more, right? That's what that positive relationship is showing us. Higher price, higher quantity. On the contrary, demand is downward slope. Because for consumers, a lower price means you're likely to buy a higher quantity, right? So as the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. And what this basic graph is allowing us to do is to think about the choices that the producers and consumers would make when they have completely different goals and expectations, right? I mean, the goal of a producer is to maximize profit, which generally means raising prices. The goal of a consumer is to buy as much as cheaply as possible. So these goals are at complete odds with one another. Nonetheless, they have to reach an agreement, okay? So in these markets, there's a few different possibilities. One possibility would be that the price is set up here. So that would be a high price. And hopefully this is all review. You all understand this, but you know, the thing to recognize about a price being too high is it seems like that would be a good deal for producers, but in general, it's not going to be, okay? Because when you set the price high, what that does is it drives down the willingness of consumers to buy the good, all right? So when the price is high, you'll get a low quantity demanded versus a high level of quantity supplied. So we've got more production than consumption, okay? So let's think about the results of this, okay? If you're a producer in this market, this is a bad deal, okay? You're getting a high price, but you are producing goods that you can't sell, right? This is showing us the amount of production. This is showing us the amount of consumption. So in this market, there's too much production, which is wasteful, right? It's never going to maximize profits when you're having to produce goods and throw them away, okay? So this is not going to be good for producers. Of course, it's not good for consumers either, right? Consumers are having to pay a high price. They're not buying a lot of the goods, so they're not happy either. So what's interesting about these markets is, despite the fact that producers and consumers have the same goal, or excuse me, have completely opposite goals, right? Producers want high prices, high quantity. Consumers want low prices and high quantity. Despite those opposite goals, it's actually in their collective best interest to operate at what is normally referred to as an equilibrium, okay? So what we've drawn so far, this would be called a surplus, all right? What would be better for both producers and consumers is if we operated here at equilibrium. At that equilibrium, the beauty is that the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, okay? So the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. That means if you're a producer, you can sell every unit you sold and there's none left over. Okay? If you raise the price any, you wouldn't be able to sell them all. And if you drop the price, you wouldn't be maximizing profits, because at the equilibrium price, you can sell every good at the highest possible price where that would be true, right? If you drop the price, you can still sell every good, but you'd have a lower price. So this is perfect for producers. For consumers, we could call this perfect as well, because if you're a consumer, that means at this price, everyone can get the good. And there's no one left, hoping to buy the good that can't find it. All right, so just to give you an analogy to this, let's say we're just going to sell chicken biscuits out on front campus. We have 100 chicken biscuits to sell. Exactly 100 consumers come in and buy those chicken biscuits, and there's no consumers left over, no wasted chicken biscuits. That would be an equilibrium. Okay, we call it an equilibrium because once you've found this perfect price, there's no reason to change from that unless there's some sort of outside force that causes the market itself to change. Okay. So what you need to be familiar with is a surplus, which is caused by a price being too high, an equilibrium, which is when the price is at the ideal level. And I'm not going to graph it, but you also need to be able to think about a shortage, okay? And that would be when the prices are too low. Make sure you can draw out a shortage as well. All right, so that's the market for supply and demand. That's basic goods. We can think about demand shifts, supply shifts. We will see that coming up. I'm confident that you guys have the skills to handle that. Just wanted to go through a quick refresher. Okay. The second market that we're going to care about. This is probably the one we'll spend the least amount of time with, to be frank. But the market for labor. The market for labor is just like any other market. It's just like supply and demand. But the difference is now we're thinking about human beings, and human beings, of course, are different. Chicken biscuits don't have emotions, right? Chicken biscuits are always the same. Once you produce a chicken biscuit, you can't make it better or worse. Labor, though, is different. Labor can change over time. You can motivate somebody to work harder. So the quality of a worker has the ability to change, unlike the quality of, say, a piece of gold, okay? So labor, we can draw this market out as well, where this is the quantity of labor. Instead of writing price up here, we're going to write wage. But really, that's all a wage is, right? It's just a price for labor. And then we'll have our labor supply and our labor demanded. The only tricky thing here to recognize is when it comes to labor supply and labor demand, normally when we think supply, we're thinking businesses. But in this case, the labor supply, this is the workers. They're the ones selling themselves, selling their time, right? So the labor supply is the workers and the labor demand is the businesses, okay? So we can think about how this market would operate, all right? It could operate at equilibrium, which would be here, right? Right at equilibrium. Do you think that's common for a labor market to operate at equilibrium? For some individual markets it is, okay? But if we think about the economy as a whole, it must not be at perfect equilibrium, right? Equilibrium would mean everybody who wants to get a job has a job. Equilibrium would also mean everybody that wants to hire a worker is able to hire a worker. It's impossible for those things to happen. We know that there's always some unemployment, okay? So this is kind of a limited resource in terms of thinking about how markets operate. But it's best to not think about the market as a whole when we think about these labor supply and labor demand curves, but rather consider individual markets, okay? So let's discuss one that's could be a pretty interesting case here in the next couple of months, all right? So let's think about the market for low-skilled labor. This is a graph I hope all of you have seen before, and again, I'm just trying to make sure that you have these key skills as we move forward. The market for low-skilled labor might have an equilibrium wage of $6.40, okay? And an equilibrium of $6.40, that means if the wage of $6.40 is reached, everyone gets a job, and every business that needs to hire a worker is able to hire a worker, okay? Unlikely that would actually happen, but we can just basically recognize that this is an imperfect model, but pretend it is perfect for our purposes here, right? Make some assumptions about how markets operate. So if we assume markets have the ability to operate perfectly, then we would expect this equilibrium to be reached, all right? And you'd have some amount of labor down here. Now let's think about what happens when you impose a minimum wage on this market. So one possibility would be to place a $4 minimum wage, okay? If you place a $4 minimum wage, the market is going to completely ignore it, okay? This is called a non-binding minimum wage. All right, a non-binding minimum wage is a minimum wage that does not affect any behaviors, okay? So if you place a $4 minimum wage on this market, I'm not even going to draw it up here, there's nothing to draw. The market will simply ignore that minimum wage and operate at equilibrium. Sometimes students don't believe this. They think that, it has to affect the market, but think about how minimum wage affects my labor, right? Think about how minimum wage affects my salary. It has no effect. In fact, if you think about it, minimum wage doesn't affect that many people directly, right? If you're making more than the minimum wage doesn't directly have any impact on how much you're earning. Basically, your salary ignores the minimum wage, okay? So if we press this thing up, though, to say anything above $6.40, like $15, we could think about how that might affect this market, okay? So if we place a $15 minimum wage on this market, all right, maybe right there, think about what impacts that would have, okay? Now the market has to account for the minimum wage. The market can't ignore it because if the market tries to operate at $6.40, it's illegal. So effectively, we've illegalized everything below the minimum wage. So what's going to occur is the workers and the businesses are going to get as close to the minimum wage as they can, right? Or excuse me, as close to the equilibrium wage as they can. So $6.40 is ideal, right? That's what would happen in a free market. They're going to get as close to that as they can. So when they pay a worker, they're going to pay exactly $15, right? This is called a binding minimum wage. So what you will see, if the theory matches with reality, is that if a $15 minimum wage is placed, lots of people will earn exactly a $15 minimum wage, especially in places that have a low equilibrium wage, like low-skilled labor in a rural area, like Milledgeville, right? A lot of people would earn exactly $15 an hour. So the result is the quantity of labor supplied goes up. Okay, think about why that would be the case. Why would the quantity of labor supplied go up? Labor supply represents the workers, okay? So when businesses raise their wages, the result is that more workers try to find a job. So you're a college student, you're not working, the minimum wage is increased to $15, you decide to start looking for a job because you know that if you can find any job, it's going to pay at least $15, okay? The second effect is on the businesses. Businesses, knowing that they have to pay more, will now reduce the amount they're willing to hire, all right? So they're going to hire fewer workers in this market for low-skilled labor. How will they get away with this? Well, one thing they might do is they may use more capital instead of labor, right? So they may replace workers with robots, for example. Another thing they might do is they may shut down, okay? Some of these businesses may just go away because they're not profitable and they're having to pay their workers more. Or a third possibility is maybe the workers will start working harder, knowing that they're paid more. These are all feasible possibilities, right? And this is what makes economics to me an interesting subject and what makes this one a particularly difficult piece of subject matter. It's very hard to see what the effects of minimum wage would be because emotions play such a large role in it, okay? So the result is, if you take this verbatim, unemployment rates would go up, right? The difference between the quantity of labor supplied and the quantity of labor demanded, think about what this is. This is workers that want to work. This is businesses' number of workers they're going to hire. So the amount between these two values is our unemployment. So the textbook graphical representation of a binding minimum wage is that unemployment goes up. In the real world, it's a bit more complicated, but it does seem to be that there is some reality to this, that indeed, if you raise minimum wage, it does seem to have some unemployment effects in a lot of cases, but not all cases, which just goes to show how complicated it is. Okay, so that's the market for labor. We'll refer to that one occasionally in this class, but it's the third one that we will see the most. We will see this one loads of times. So the third model we will see is the market for loanable funds. All right, and I'm grouping all these together because let's face it, they're all really the same market. So it's a good starting place for this class to deal with very basic models that we can really wrap our heads around, okay? So market for goods, that's just stuff that you might normally buy. We mentioned chicken sandwiches, labor, workers, right? Loanable funds, this is the market for saving and borrowing money. The market for saving and borrowing money, okay? So when we think about this market, on the x-axis here, we've got the quantity of loanable funds. Okay, now when I say loanable funds, what I'm really referring to here is money. Okay, this is kind of strange. Normally we put dollar values on the y-axis, but in this case, the quantity is the money. All right, now why don't I just go ahead and just say quantity of money? Well, we're talking about specific money. I've got 20 bucks in my wallet right now. It is not in this market. Okay, it is not in the loanable funds market. I've also got money in a checking account. Now that is in this market, all right? So this is specifically thinking about money that is in specifically the market for saving and borrowing, okay? This is a market that has so many people in it, okay? Everyone who's watching this video right now is in this market. And I would say there's a good chance you're on both sides of the market, all right? In this market, we've got two groups. We've got the savers. I will explain in a bit why it's upward sloping, okay? This is a supply curve. This is people supplying money, call those savers. Then there's the people demanding money. Those are the borrowers. So if you think about it, this is a market that has just so much activity. This is the biggest market, okay? Let me just give you an example for me right now. At this moment in time, I have a checking account, I have stocks, I have bonds, okay? So this is all forms of supplying money, all forms of saving money. At the same time, I have multiple credit cards. I have a mortgage for a house that I live in right now and a mortgage for a house that I'm trying to sell. So I'm in this borrowing side of the market too. Think about that. I have a tremendous amount of wealth, of my own personal money baked into either side of this market. The majority of my entire net worth is in this market. And I'm on both sides of the market, which is very unusual. It's weird to be on both sides of the market, right? It doesn't happen very often. All right, I mentioned chicken biscuits before. I bet a lot of you buy chicken biscuits sometimes. But I doubt you buy and sell chicken biscuits all the time. Okay, I bet that's not something you do very often. And furthermore, what's unique about this market is you're in it all the time when you're in it. My money's in a checking account right now. I've had a checking account since I was like 18, right? My mortgage, I've had mortgages for like 10 years, okay? So those things, you're in it constantly, all right? So this is a market that we spend so much time in. So it's a market that we should really try to understand. It also does a lot of really important things, and we're going to kind of talk about that in the next couple of videos. All right, so, when we talked about goods, we labeled price. When we talked about labor, it was wage. For loanable funds, this is going to be our interest rate. And I trust that all of you know what an interest rate is, right? And just like high prices are good for some, bad for others, same deal with interest rates. Interest rates are great when they're high, when you're a saver. But if you're a borrower, you don't like high interest rates. So just like any other market, there is a disconnect between the goals of the supply curve, the savers, and the demand, which in this case is the borrowers. So thinking about this market, there's a couple of different possibilities. One might be that we operate right at equilibrium. Okay. Think about what that would mean. Equilibrium would mean that everybody who wants to borrow at a given rate is able to do so. It would mean if you want to save money at a given rate, you're able to do so. Does this market operate at equilibrium? Well, it's a tough one to talk about. It's a tough one to think about. In some cases it does, some cases it doesn't. But rest assured, this is a market that is extremely important, right? For our class, it's extremely important. This is money and banking, right? So the market for money being saved and borrowed, that's a huge deal for a money and banking class. Secondly, it's incredibly important to society in general, When you go out and get a mortgage, you're going to care a lot about interest rates. When you have money in the stock market, you're going to care a ton about the interest rates. It's going to affect your ability to retire, you know. It's going to affect taxes on capital gains. It affects so much. So this is a market that we're going to put a lot of emphasis on. So that's just an introduction there. 3 markets: goods, labor, loanable funds.